iteration. So the point is, when any change occurred inside the iterating items, one new item added or an item removed, then entire data is iterated again. That means entire collection is iterated again. So we have to prevent the iteration of all items again and again. We need to just add only the changes. Iteration should happen and update only the changes. For that, we need track by. So what we done is we created a track change method. This method will get the index number, or it will get the product ID and return the product ID. Track by is used in the iteration. Track by is used in the iteration. It will point towards that function. So that function returns the product number, product ID. If there is a change in product ID, then it will perform this iteration one more time. So, and not all items, only that newly added ID, only that newly added index. Iteration will work only for that index. That generally improves the performance. Already yesterday, we saw one example how it works. We saw the tracking. You can see I'm opening this and open the debugger. Here in the elements, we can see the table contains rows. 3 rows are there. When I click add using API button, one more row is added to collection, to the existing rows. But existing rows which are already generated, they will not be generated again. Only the new option will be added. You can observe right side, only that last row is added. And when you click again, it's not adding again and again. That means because there is no change more than that we have seen here. So technically, the iteration will work only for the newly added option. If any change occurred, then it will work. So this is very much required when you are using services and all, because data comes from service and use. Services, later we will see how to use them. This is just hard-coded data. We learned one example. Next, important here, while working with iterations, we need to know about another option, that is iterations and conditions. Iterations and conditions. So together, how we can manage them, how to handle iterations and conditions, right? So what review you want? Just now I showed you. Yesterday, what we done to understand track change, we created a collection, right? We created a collection. I showed you clearly 2 points there. We created a collection. In the collection, the same collection is repeating again, but one new item added. Then simple iteration will work for all the existing items again. We don't want iteration to work for all existing item again. We want only for the last item. Understood? Later we will see, right, how to use the APIs and all. Only simple point is the iteration will work for the existing items again and again. Iteration should not work for existing items. It should work for only new added item. Then you have to use track by. Then track by should know item added or not by using a function. By using a function. We have to know by using a function. So the function is track change. This track change function will verify the newly added product ID. So that means if it returns the newly added product ID, that is number 4, it will not return the existing IDs. It will return the last ID. That means because you have said return product ID, it will return last ID. And in the iteration, that last ID is not there. Then what happens? It will add that last ID related product only into the iteration. It will not add all the existing. So what track by can do? Track by can identify the newly added item and it will add only that item into iteration. It will not recreate the iteration every time. The difference is without track by, when you run this, without track by, when you run this, when I click on this table body and when I click on this add using API, it will add all the rows again. I click again, it will generate again. I click again, it will generate again. Every time they are generating. Why you are generating every time? These rows, they should be generated only when change occurred. Then we have to use track by. By using track by, we have to point a function that returns what change occurred. That means track change. Track change. So track change returns the newly added ID into that iteration. Now iteration will work only for that. That means this time iteration will not work for all of them. You can see the same. This time iteration will work. Add using API, it will work only for the last one. After adding the last one, it will not add again and again. It will not regenerate again and again. Even I click again, it's not working. Why? Because there is no more change here. So iteration will work only when change occurred. And only the newly added item will be added into the list. Right? Yesterday, clearly I told you track change is not a function, it is a function pointer. So yesterday I clearly told you, Anil, it is not a function calling, it is a function pointer. Understood? It is a function pointer, not a function calling. Yesterday I told you clearly, it is not function calling. You don't use any parameters and parentheses, pointing towards the function. Right? Yeah. Then pointer doesn't require a parenthesis to write. Yeah. So this is one simple option. Next, how we can handle conditions over iterations. What is the basic thing about conditions and iterations? Generally, how we can handle conditions over iterations. That means in the iteration, how we handle condition. Generally, suppose in a program level, if we want only specific option to extract from an iteration, then generally when we write for, inside the for, we use conditions. We use conditions. So we use conditions to break the iteration. So, or it is not breaking so that we can perform only for specific. So technically, conditions are used inside iteration at the logic level. Here in UI also we can manage that. In UI level also, we can have conditions inside iterations. How we need conditions inside iteration? Let's create one example. So let's add a new component. Okay, let's add a new component. Ng generate component conditions skip test. Okay, so we are adding a new component called conditions. Fine. Now after adding the conditions, so let's keep this in the startup. App conditions. So this is in the startup. So we have app conditions. Okay, let's keep this in the bootstrap, that is conditions component. Okay, conditions component, it is working fine. Okay, let's go to the conditions component and how to handle conditions and iterations. Let's check that. So suppose here we have some data. So we are adding some data. So here we have public products is data. It is an array. We have product name, some earpods, something like this, and the price of the product, some product price, and we have photo. So we have assets. So earpods dot jpg something, and we have so, and one more property we will add here is this belongs to a category called electronics. Okay, so we have name and just we define some night casuals, and we have price and some price, and we have photo and assets slash shoe.jpg, and this belongs to category footwear. Okay, now similarly, so some products we are adding, we need some collection of products. So like suppose this is like JBL speaker, and this is like some so Lee Cooper boot. Okay, and this is like, and like jeans, something we have jeans, and different price we are. Okay, so just we define the options in this way. Okay, so let's configure that, and photos relative to that contents here we are having. So that is so this is a shoe, this is another one is this is JBL speaker PG, and here some shoe one dot jpg, this is shirt dot jpg, and here we change the category. This is electronics again, and this is footwear, this is some fashion. Okay, this is some fashion. Okay, now here this is the general data we are having, and we have a collection of categories. Categories is an array with all, and with electronics and with footwear and with fashion. These are all the categories. We have all the categories configured here, configuring all the categories and defining them here. Now, important is we need to handle. So here, so we have the options. Yeah, the presentation. Let's go to the presentation in the HTML. So we are designing the presentation with a class as a container fluid. Container fluid, we are adding this, and we have a div class as a row, and in this we have a div, and in the div class we are configuring. So in the div we have class as call3 that is defined, another div. So this is class as call9. Okay, and here in this we have a simple div, so class as form group, and we have a label as select a category. Select a category, and here we have a div with a drop down. Drop down, it is having a class as form control. So form control. In this, I want this drop down. This is the drop down, and I want the drop down to have the list of all items. That means we need an option. Option should be generated for all categories. That means we will use ng for. So let item of categories, and I want to print that item here. We need to print item here. That means all the categories will be here. So all the categories will be here. So all electronics, footwear, the categories will be here. And we want to display the products there. We need to display the products here. That means we need to configure the products collection here. So the products, so beside that, we need to display the products. So then in this column, I am designing a div, a class as card deck. And in this, I am designing a div and this class as card. This card should repeat. Actually, this card should repeat for all the products. So ng for I am using let item of products. And I will create a class as card header. And in that, so I just want to define the name of the product here, there. So I'll just define a heading. Yeah, heading as name. That means item dot name. That is the name. And below that we have a class as card body. In the card body we have image. Here we need to display width. So and height 150 and height 150. Okay, width and the height defined there. And the source is coming from item.photo. And we have a div. This is class as card footer, and this is having again a heading, so which contains item.price and currency. So currency as INR. Okay, so that is the icons and all the products related information here. So all the products related information is here. We have all the products related data here, right? Technically, now what happens here is right side, we have all the products. So left side, we have categories. And I want only the categories related products there. Which category I am selecting, only that category related product should come. Only that category related products must display. So if user selects all should come. And if user selects electronics, only electronics should come. So we need to display that. So we need to handle that. So we need to configure the details. You can display in any way. So you want, I just wrapped them side by side. You can put 2 column, 3 column, any number of columns, 2 per column, 3 per column. Here the important is how you will filter them. Currently iteration is working for all. Iteration should not work for all. Iteration should work for only the products whose category is matching with the category you are selecting. Then first, how we can get the selected category name. So I will create a property. We will create a property selected category name. Category name. So it is by default, it is some all. Okay. And we need to attach this to the drop down. So by using a two-way binding, so ng model, we are attaching selected category name. That means when user changes the category, when users changes the category, that category name will be stored here. Okay, now what we are doing is we are performing here iteration. So here I don't want iteration for all. I want iteration only for the item, only for the items whose category name is matching with selected category name. That means I want iteration for items, only the items. Generally, if we are using logic, means in general programming logic, we write like this: for var item of collection. Collection is products. And here we write an if condition. If item dot category is equal to electronics, something like this, electronics, then we have to display. Then it will display only those. If we want multiple, you can use or, right? You can say item dot category is equal to some footwear. Like this we have to write. So generally, logically, we have to write like this in the logic, but we are now in the presentation. And one basic rule I told you, in the presentation, so here in the for, I cannot use ng if here, ng if. There cannot be two structural directives in one element. You can see that already we discussed. A structural directive. So you are using a structural directive. And the important is, this is one key point here. That means it says that we are trying to render some information in that structural directive, and see that cannot have multiple template bindings on one template, on one element. Right? Only one attribute prefixed with asterisk n. You cannot have multiple. You cannot have multiple structural directives or multiple template bindings on one element. So you will not write here. We will not write here. Now what should happen is, suppose now what I am doing here. So I need to write below. I need to write below. But if below I am using, so any another option here, it will disturb my cards presentation. Then what I have to do is, I need to use this. I need to use this condition. That means this card should be generated for a condition, based on condition. Iteration should be defined. Suppose I write a div here. And in that I am writing this iteration. Inside the div, I will write the card. That means 2 levels we will write. That is not good, because in a card deck, you are using a general div. Then it will disturb the alignments again. That means now I need one container which will handle my logic, but it will handle my logic, but it will not affect the structure of page. Then we use an ng container. Ng container. It is an Angular container. In this Angular container, we are writing this iterator. And inside that container, I am keeping this card. The card is kept inside that container. That means we are keeping the card inside the container. The card is inside the container. Why you are not using a div? Because it will disturb my HTML presentation. I need one container, so which should not disturb this existing presentation. That means it should be like virtual container. It will not structurally affect my application, but it should use iterations. It should be dynamically handling my concept, but it should not have any dynamic effect on my structure of page. Then we put this here. I will save this now. I will save this. You can see the presentation is as usual, no change. Is as usual, no change is there. Suppose we will try here ng template. You remember I told you ng template. Container is iterating the card, but I don't want card for every product. I want card based on a condition. Then here we can use ng if. This card should be displayed if selected category is equal to all. Selected category is equal to all, or we can use or selected category name is matching with item.category. That's how we have to define. That means this function should work based on a condition. Condition is if selected category is all, then display all. If selected category is matching with the item category, then display only those. So that means if we'll add and remove, if we'll add all products, if the selected category is all, if we'll add only the products which are matching with that particular category name, whose category name is matching with the category name. This category name is coming from drop down because it is binded to drop down at the top, that is coming from drop down. In drop down, whatever you selected, it will come here. If condition will verify, is it all? Then it will add all. Otherwise, it will verify, is it matching with any category? If it is matching with any category, then it will display. So you can see now, you can see here. So in this now, I click here and select electronics. Only electronic products will come. I click here and select footwear. Only footwear products will come. I click here and select fashion. Only fashion products will come. And I'm selecting all, then all products will come. That's it. That means a simple iteration, how we can manage. Iteration, how we can manage. That means which product you want, you can configure that. We can display that. That means we are using a condition, right? So simple template is to just hold some data, not to perform any dynamic operations. Container is for performing dynamic operations. Understood? Template is for only holding data, and container is for handling manipulation. Clear? Kumar? Right? Yeah, that's it. So this is general thing. So when we are dealing, that is the general thing. So these are options how we can manage conditions. So depending on your requirement, later in how you design, that's your that means you put generally you put a drop down or you put a radio button. You can choose anything. So here I'm using a drop down. I'm using a drop down. Through a drop down, I'm displaying. You can use a radio button. Through radio button also you can manage, because radio button allows you to choose one. But if there are many categories, then it is difficult. Later, when you have events to understand, when we learn about events, we can generally, when we learn about events, we can use even typing also, right? When user is typing some category name, you can search and get them. For that, we need some key up, key down like events. So this is one basic. That means this is one example how we can handle iterations. That means here what we are doing is, so ng for, so that means ng for is for iterations, and ng if is for conditions. Right. So you can handle conditions. So within iterations. And one important point is one element cannot handle all of them. That means multiple. That means a single HTML element cannot have multiple template bindings. So you have to use so Angular container. Right? So that is Angular container, that is ng container. We have to use that Angular container, ng container. So when we are specially dealing, means actually we don't need a container if you have your HTML thing working fine in the background, because if your HTML divs and spans are okay with the presentation, then you can go with them. If not, then you have to manage this. So for example, the point is here generally, so when you are displaying the content, so example for this is, we are just adding conditions. In that we don't have any events, just we have some data. So conditions.component.ts. Here we don't have any events, just we have some data with products and categories and the name, category name, which category they selected. And in the presentation, we are just using conditions.component.html. And this is the presentation we have. That is the presentation here. You can manage that in different ways depending on different situations actually. That means presentation, your wish actually. Suppose I want here, instead of a drop down, I want some radio buttons. Then usually if you want radio buttons, so then I just give here an unordered list. And for this class as a list, so list unstyled. And we have a list item. And here we have input type. Input type is equal to radio. Obviously radio should have a name, because a common name must be there for that, right? Category. So that means categories, right? Okay. Categories is the name for the radio. And we have some radios. We have some radios, all are having the same name, all are having the same name, but the text will be like all. This will be like electronics. This will be like footwear. This will be like fashion. And very important is these all radios are binded with only one model, NG model, that is a selected category name. All radios are binded with the same selected category name, with the same selected category name. All radios are binded with the same selected category name, because out of all, only one will work. Now you can see this time. So right side we have radio. So we have radio. So I will just put a style here. So font. So suppose say font size as some 20 pixel. So just some little bit font size increase it for the list items. Okay. Yeah. So little bit font size increase it for those options. Okay. Now you can see I select electronics, then only, so electronics, fashion. So any one should come. That means only one option should come. So here all are referring to selected category name. Then now important is this selected category name is by default having a value called all. We are having a option called all. That means we are configuring all. So that means actually all values are important. That means these are only text we are having. That means what we do is, for this we need a value. Value is all. Okay. What about another one? Its value is electronics, because when you select radio, its value will be passed. Value is footwear. And here the value is fashion. Okay. Now you can see that only the values are defined. Now you select electronics, you select footwear, you select fashion, only those details will come. That means we are binding them, so with the radios, and we are adding with the radios. So technically, so how you design and which controls you use depending on your requirement, only the point is you need to understand which property is required to identify its value. Rest of logic will go on same. The presentation is just different. That means I am replacing. So here using radios instead of drop down. Then no change. So just what you have to do is in the UI, you have to replace that selected category group, selected category form group with just this radios. But if there are many options, you cannot depend on radios. That is the key point here. So you can see these are all the radios. Everything same, just you have to make change into this. That means using radios instead of drop down. You can configure that directly. You can use buttons also, but the logic is how you handle the buttons. That means how do we configure the buttons? Buttons with different icons, different symbols you can configure. You can generate buttons. Actually, we are using radio. Here, these are radios. And we are writing the radios, configuring the radios. Now the point is, instead of writing the radios, can't we iterate the radios? That means can't we perform iteration over the radios? So generally, this is writing all the radios required for you. So that means now what I'm doing here is I'm removing all these options. Okay, I'm creating a list item, the list item. This list item is using an ng for let item of categories. And the list item will have input type is equal to radio. And its name is categories. Its name is categories. But important, so here the text will be text will be item. That means the category name will come, and value also will be the same. So that means value also, so will get from, the value also will get from, so item, it will get from item. That means now you are performing an iteration over radios and you are generating it. And here you can see when we are defining that iteration over radios and generating them, you can see the radios are there. So electronics, footwear, and fashion. For this, you need to bind a model that gets the value from that. That means here we are using a model, ng model, and we are defining selected category name. All are referring to the same. That means by default, you will get the selected category name. Electronics, footwear, fashion, everything works fine. That means you don't need to write all the contents. You can just perform the iteration. Right? We can perform the iteration. We can perform the iteration. So technically, the iteration is configured by using this. Iteration is configured by using this. That means the same thing. Just what we are doing is, instead of writing all these individually, so we can go more better. That means we can define this is the radios. This is one example. So the example individual radios, and here we are defining an example like it can handle iteration over radios. You can handle an iteration over radios. That means here we configured the iteration over radios, and you can see, so this is the same thing, only this part changes. This time we are using iteration over radios. We are configuring iteration over radios. So that is iteration over radios. That means you just create one radio and you iterate it, but important is you need to understand the value should be the name of the item, and the type should be radio. The name should be same. The value is changing and the text is changing. That means the name and value are changing. The text and value are changing. That you have to configure for iteration. You can use this type of navigation, means actually different websites, you have different scenarios. Actually, no need to tell all the scenarios for a general technical guys, right? Because if I tell that this is how we manage, then obviously a HTML general designer knows that, okay, if radios, then I need to manage in this way. We don't need to tell for every point actually. So you must be able to explore that by yourself actually. For example, suppose generally we can have buttons. That means we can design buttons instead of this ordered list and unordered list. Ordered list and unordered list. So here we have select a category, and we are adding a button here. So buttons. So that means we are defining the buttons. In the buttons we are having, so we can put options like all. So we can put button, so like so electronics. We can use button like footwear. You can use button like fashion. These are buttons. But important is how you manage for the buttons. That means when the button is clicked, I want those details to display. How you configure the buttons and display them. So that means you can use buttons. You can write like a menu or configuration. Usually we can configure that. Generally what we have to do is, so we need to use, actually all buttons can point towards the same function. All buttons can point towards the same function. That means generally, this is where you need to think more in depth about the concept. Actually, see, the point is all these are buttons. Generally, we all have these buttons. And suppose I kept these buttons. I kept these buttons temporarily. Let's keep these buttons temporarily inside this column only, where we have That means in this area only. So we are configuring those buttons in that area itself. So there, and I have the column here. So I don't have any column, just we have that column defined. Okay. And this is 12 that occupies everything. Fine. Now important is, this is how the concept, this is how the content is present. Now at the top, when I click on these buttons, all the buttons can point towards the same option. That means what we do is here, so we write a event public. Public is menu selection. Menu selection is a function. This menu selection function, so menu selection function, so is used for all the buttons. That means every button uses a click. On the click, we use menu selection. On the click, we use a menu selection. Now important is all buttons are using the same. All buttons are using the same. Now already I told you, so we can have button have value. So button can have name. This button name is all, and this button name is electronics. Electronics. And this button name is footwear. And this button name is fashion. Now the point is how you can send these button names into that function. So just we have to use $event. So by using $event, this point, so I told you, by using $event, we can send that value. That means button related. So this is the categories, actually categories here. Now what should happen is when user clicks the button, so button related all properties are passed here. We need to collect all the properties. Through E we can access all the properties. Now what we have to do is this dot selected category name is equal to E dot. We learnt about target dot value, or target dot name. That means that particular button name is accessed here and it is assigned to this category name. That means current category name changes based on this button selection. When user clicks on any specific button, user clicks on that specific button, usually what happens, the button related categories will come and display. We don't need any switch or iterations or anything, means switch or any other concepts to use here. Just you have to think the logic more better than what you know actually. That means you should know that it is not like every time I use a switch case lengthy, right? Because you know the architecture, you know the situation, then you need to keep it more short and more better, right? We don't need any switch condition for this. Just simple. You collect the button name and use the button name as selected category name. Then how do we pass the button name? This is how we pass the button name. That is the basic approach. So that means the same concept. So different techniques are there. Because if you are actually strong in HTML, then and JavaScript, buttons navigation, then these type of things you can try by your own by thinking, so based on the structure and the requirements. I just given you various techniques of handling this. Everything same. Only one extra option is there. This we have to add. So we have to add following method into TS file .ts. We need to add that method into TS file. This is the method we need to the TS file. That is the method we need to add TS file. And in the HTML, we are making change. So .html file means same example. In the .html, we are just adding these buttons. We are adding these buttons and keeping that. Are using same event on click, but button related value, a button related name is different. Now, actually, you can perform an iteration over this button, and you can generate buttons also you can perform through iterations. You don't need to configure everything in this way. You know that buttons also can be designed by using iteration. You try that. Only the point is name comes dynamically from iteration value, and button text also comes from iteration value. One button is enough. You can generate buttons for every category automatically, because whenever category added, a button should be generated for it. So that you do through iterations, right? This is general approach how we can manage the adoption. Now, once you know this, how to handle these iterations and conditions. Now we need to go into another important is attribute directives. These are all structural directives. We need to know attribute directives, how to deal with them. That we will see in our next session, right? Tomorrow we will continue with this. We will see how do we deal with and work with attribute directives, right? For 2-3 sessions, our session will end exactly by 7. After that, we will continue as regular, right? For 2-3 sessions, we will stop the session exactly by 7, right? Okay, fine. So let's meet tomorrow then, right? We will discuss about attribute directives then.